February 17th, 2009. Across Latin America, thousands of investors are still asleep. Retirees, teachers, and small business owners believe their savings are safely stored inside one of the world's most successful private banks. Within hours, that belief will collapse. That morning, the Securities and Exchange Commission files a sweeping civil complaint in federal court in Dallas. The charges name Alan Stanford, his Antiguan-based Stanford International Bank, his Houston brokerage, and 2 senior executives. At Stanford's Houston headquarters, police move in. Offices are locked down. Court orders arrive demanding records. Stanford himself isn't there. 2 days later, FBI agents locate him at a relative's home in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and serve him with the SEC's court filings. By then, the news has already spread. Panic ripples across multiple countries. In Antigua, depositors swarm a second Stanford-controlled bank, demanding their money back. Guards turn them away. The institution that promised safety and stability for nearly 2 decades is suddenly fighting for survival. At the center of it all is one man, Alan Stanford, Texas businessman, Caribbean banking magnate, owner of private jets, knighted by a nation. A man whose image had been carefully built to represent success, power, and legitimacy. But regulators now claim the empire behind that image was largely an illusion involving roughly $7 billion. And that raises a remarkable question. How does someone maintain a multi-billion-dollar deception for nearly 20 years? The answer involves offshore banking, political influence, celebrity status, and one astonishing fact: the regulator responsible for investigating Stanford was secretly helping protect him. Long before the private jets and celebrity status, Alan Stanford was simply an ambitious businessman from Texas. Born in Mexia, Texas in 1950, he attended Baylor University and spent years pursuing various business ventures. Some succeeded, some failed. But Stanford possessed a skill that would prove more valuable than business expertise. He understood perception. He understood that people rarely invest based purely on numbers. They invest based on trust, and trust is often built through appearances. In the late 1980s, Stanford expanded into the Caribbean, eventually establishing Stanford International Bank in Antigua. On paper, it appeared to be an exclusive offshore institution serving wealthy international clients. But Stanford wasn't just building a bank. He was building a persona. Through private jets, luxury events, charitable donations, and relationships with politicians, he created the image of a successful global financier. Every public appearance reinforced the same message. Wealth became evidence. Prestige became proof. And few people stopped to ask whether either was real. And the strategy worked. More investors arrived every year. In Antigua, Stanford became the country's largest private employer, with holdings that included banks, a newspaper, restaurants, and an airline. Then came one of the strongest symbols of credibility imaginable: a knighthood. In 2006, Antigua's Governor General knighted him, and he became known across the Caribbean as Sir Alan. For many investors, the title carried enormous psychological weight. A knight, a banking magnate, a philanthropist, a respected international financier. What could possibly go wrong? The answer was simple: almost everything. At the heart of Stanford's empire was a surprisingly ordinary product: certificates of deposit. CDs are normally among the safest and most boring investments available, but Stanford offered something different: higher returns. While traditional banks offered modest interest rates, Stanford International Bank promised returns well above market norms. Even more impressive, those returns appeared remarkably consistent. For at least 15 years, according to the SEC's complaint. Markets rose, markets fell, economic crises came and went, yet Stanford's performance seemed almost unaffected. To investors, it looked extraordinary. That should have been a warning sign. Because legitimate investing involves risk. Real portfolios fluctuate. Real markets experience losses. But according to regulators, the financial statements behind those returns were, in their words, fictional. Clients were told their money was invested in sophisticated strategies unavailable to ordinary investors. The reports looked professional. The explanations sounded convincing. The numbers appeared impressive. But investigators concluded much of it was fabricated. There was no secret formula producing exceptional returns year after year. Instead, prosecutors alleged that new investor money was being used to pay returns owed to earlier investors. The only thing keeping the system alive was the constant arrival of new money paying for old promises. But investors never saw the machinery behind the curtain. What they saw was success, and Stanford knew exactly how to display it. One of Stanford's smartest investments had nothing to do with banking. It was cricket. Across much of the world, cricket is more than a sport. It is a cultural institution followed by millions. Stanford spent heavily to place himself at the center of that world. He sponsored tournaments, built facilities, and funded major events. His most famous promotion was a winner-take-all cricket match carrying a $20 million prize. The headlines were global. The publicity was enormous. Athletes appeared beside him. Politicians welcomed him. International organizations did business with him. To the average investor, the message seemed obvious. If all these respected institutions trusted Alan Stanford, why shouldn't they? That was exactly the point. Every sponsorship, every headline, and every public appearance functioned as advertising for trust. But behind the celebrity image and public prestige, the foundation was beginning to crack. By the time the scheme collapsed, roughly 30,000 investors across more than 100 countries had entrusted billions of dollars to Stanford's organization. Many believed they were investing in one of the safest financial institutions in the world. They were wrong. And another story was quietly unfolding behind the scenes, a story involving regulators. Because the biggest question was no longer whether Stanford was lying. The biggest question was this: who was helping him? The answer would lead investigators to a regulator whose job was to stop fraud, not protect it. For years, Stanford appeared untouchable. The returns seemed unusually consistent. Competitors were skeptical. Some analysts quietly questioned how the bank continued producing such impressive results regardless of market conditions. By 2005, the SEC had begun seriously investigating Stanford International Bank. But because the bank was based in Antigua, American investigators depended heavily on cooperation from Antiguan regulators. That cooperation never seriously materialized. The man responsible for overseeing Stanford's bank was Leroy King, head of Antigua's Financial Services Regulatory Commission. According to prosecutors, King took more than $500,000 in bribes from Stanford, including cash, private jet flights, and Super Bowl tickets, in exchange for shielding the bank from scrutiny and feeding Stanford's team information about the SEC's inquiries. The consequences were enormous, because regulators depend on accurate information, and when the watchdog is compromised, oversight collapses entirely. The institution responsible for exposing problems was, according to prosecutors, helping conceal them. And every additional year mattered, because during those years more families continued depositing money, more retirement savings flowed into the system, and the eventual damage grew larger, much larger. King would later flee prosecution for a decade before being extradited to the United States in 2019. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. Then came 2008, the global financial crisis. Markets crashed, confidence evaporated. Regulators faced enormous pressure to identify hidden risks before they exploded. On February 17, 2009, that pressure caught up with Alan Stanford. The SEC filed its complaint. Assets were frozen, the receivership began. The reaction was immediate. Investors panicked. Branch offices were overwhelmed. Governments launched investigations. News organizations around the world covered the story. The image of the respected offshore banker began collapsing in real time. Stanford denied wrongdoing, but the evidence continued to grow. Several insiders cooperated with investigators, including Chief Financial Officer James Davis. According to prosecutors, the sophisticated investment portfolio promoted to investors simply did not exist as advertised. Investors had purchased certainty; what they received was fiction. In June 2009, Stanford was indicted and arrested. After years of delays, including a prison assault that he claimed had affected his memory, his trial finally began in January 2012. In March 2012, a federal jury convicted Stanford on 13 of 14 counts, including wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 110 years in federal prison. The empire was gone. The illusion was over. Financial fraud is often measured in numbers. Millions, billions, percentages. But numbers hide the human story. Behind every dollar lost was a person, a family, a retirement plan, a lifetime of work. Many victims believed they were choosing safety rather than speculation. That was the tragedy. The scheme succeeded because it appeared trustworthy. A court-appointed receiver spent years attempting to recover assets and return money to victims. But recovering funds from a collapsed Ponzi scheme is notoriously difficult. By the time fraud is exposed, much of the money is already gone. For thousands of investors, the consequences lasted years. Some delayed retirement, some returned to work, some never fully recovered financially. But perhaps the most important lesson is not about Alan Stanford alone. It is about how appearances can overpower skepticism. The private jets, the luxury offices, the cricket stadiums, the political connections, the knighthood, each symbol communicated the same message. This man is successful, this man is legitimate, this man can be trusted, and that was the real product being sold. Not certificates of deposit, not investment strategies, trust. Alan Stanford sold trust, and for nearly 20 years, tens of thousands of people bought it. Today, the empire is gone. Leroy King has served his sentence and Stanford remains in federal prison. But the conditions that allowed his rise still exist. Offshore secrecy, regulatory failures, prestige mistaken for proof. History suggests another Alan Stanford will eventually appear. The details may change. The warning signs will not. Extraordinary returns, extraordinary prestige, and a story that sounds too good to question. Roughly $7 billion, 30,000 victims, nearly 20 years of deception. Alan Stanford's greatest achievement was not building a bank. It was convincing people that success itself was evidence of legitimacy. And that illusion survived for nearly 2 decades. Until one Tuesday morning, February 17, 2009. Alan Stanford didn't build a $7 billion fraud with lies alone. He built it with trust, and that is why his story still matters. The most dangerous frauds rarely introduce themselves as frauds. They introduce themselves as success stories.